There is a moment before the thinking starts when the body simply wants the score to be even. The impulse is older than any legal system, older than any formal concept of justice, older than any word available for describing it. Research has established that the desire to punish those who wrong us, even at personal cost to ourselves, is not a learned social behavior. It is a feature of the human organism that appears cross-culturally, develops in children before formal moral instruction, and shares functional characteristics with analogous behaviors in other social species. The revenge impulse is not a failure of reason or a weakness of character. It is an ancient algorithm shaped by evolution, running on neural hardware that was built for a specific and important social function. Understanding what that function was and why the algorithm now so reliably produces outcomes that are the opposite of what it was designed for is where the science of revenge begins. In 2002, the economists Ernst Fehr and Simon Gechter published research in Nature documenting what they called altruistic punishment, the willingness of individuals to punish defectors in a group cooperation game at cost to themselves, even when no personal material benefit was possible from the punishment. In their public goods experiment, players could contribute to a shared resource or free ride on others' contributions. When given the opportunity to punish free riders, participants did so consistently and intensely, reducing the defectors' payoffs even when it cost them money to do so. The punishment was described as altruistic because it could not benefit the punisher materially. Fehr and Gechter interpreted this finding as evidence that humans have a strong intrinsic motivation to punish norm violations, a motivation that operates independently of strategic calculation and that appears to be driven by the negative emotions the violation generates. Research has found consistent associations between the intensity of the punisher's negative emotional response and the intensity of the punishment imposed. The angrier participants reported being, the more they were willing to pay to punish. This relationship suggests that the punishment was emotionally motivated rather than strategically calculated. Fehr and Gechter's finding has been replicated across cultures, across experimental paradigms, and across variants of the cooperation game. The result was important because it challenged the rational actor model of human behavior. People were not punishing only when it served their material interests. They were punishing because something in their response to unfairness was demanding a response, regardless of cost. If the impulse you are trying to understand is still active tonight, like and subscribe before we go further. The impulse is ancient. The anatomy it built is visible. In 2004, Dominique de Quervain and colleagues published a positron emission tomography study in Science examining the neural correlates of the decision to punish unfair partners in an economic exchange. Participants who had been treated unfairly could either punish the defector at a cost to themselves, effective punishment that reduced the defector's payoff, or exercise a symbolic, costless punishment that had no actual effect. PET scanning revealed that, in participants who reported a desire to punish, the decision to exercise effective punishment was associated with significant activation in the dorsal striatum, and specifically in the head of the caudate nucleus, a region associated with the processing of anticipated reward and goal-directed action. Crucially, the activation was stronger for effective punishment than for symbolic punishment, and participants who reported the strongest desire to punish showed the greatest caudate activation. The study provided the first direct neuroimaging evidence that punishing those who wrong us activates the brain's reward circuitry, that revenge at the level of the brain is experienced as something worth having. Have you ever noticed the specific quality of satisfaction that comes not from having repaired something, but from imagining the persons who hurt you finally feeling what you felt? The finding that revenge activates the reward system does not mean that revenge produces lasting satisfaction, a distinction that becomes critical throughout the research and that will occupy much of this script. What de Quervain's study demonstrated is that the anticipation of revenge, the decision to punish the moment before the punishment is delivered, activates the neural machinery of anticipated reward. The brain treats the prospect of revenge the way it treats the prospect of any valued outcome, with a release of dopaminergic activity in the striatal circuits that motivate goal-directed behavior. This is the neural basis of the colloquial experience that revenge is sweet, not because it delivers lasting satisfaction, but because the anticipation of it is genuinely pleasurable, in the same way that anticipating any desired outcome is pleasurable before the outcome is experienced. The evolutionary account of altruistic punishment proposes that the willingness to punish norm violators, even at personal cost, was an evolutionarily stable strategy that solved a specific problem in ancestral group living environments. Groups that contained individuals willing to punish defectors maintained higher levels of cooperation than groups that did not. The punisher paid a cost, but the group benefited from the norm enforcement, and the norm enforcement ultimately produced a cooperative environment that benefited the punisher as well. Research on evolutionary game theory has found that costly punishment can be evolutionarily stable when group selection operates. When the benefits of belonging to a cooperative group offset the individual costs of punishing, the revenge impulse on this account is the emotional enforcement mechanism of social norms, the psychological pressure that keeps individuals from defecting in an environment where defection would undermine the cooperative fabric everyone depends on. The deterrence function of revenge is one of its most consistently proposed evolutionary purposes. By demonstrating that violations will be punished, the punisher signals to the entire social network that they are not a low-cost target. Research on reputation and revenge has found that reputation for vengeance has historically served as a genuine deterrent to aggression. Communities and individuals known to punish transgressions reliably were less likely to be targeted than those perceived as tolerant of violations. The revenge impulse, from this perspective, is not primarily about the specific transgression. It is about the signal the response to the transgression sends to the broader social environment about the punisher's limits. Have you ever wanted the person who hurt you to understand? Not just to suffer, but to know, specifically, what the harm felt like from the inside. The role of humiliation in triggering the revenge impulse is distinct from the role of simple harm. Research has consistently found that the intensity of revenge motivation is more strongly predicted by the experience of humiliation, the public or private degradation of the self's social status and dignity, than by the material size of the harm itself. A person who has been materially harmed but whose dignity was not attacked shows weaker revenge motivation than a person who suffered a smaller material harm that involved disrespect, contempt, or deliberate degradation. Research on honor cultures, social systems organized around the primacy of personal and family reputation, has found this pattern in its most extreme form. The harm that triggers the strongest revenge response is not the material loss, but the insult, the disrespect, the act of treating the person as someone who can be violated without consequence. Moral outrage functions as the emotional engine of the revenge impulse. The affective state that translates the cognitive recognition of a norm violation into the motivational pressure to respond. Research has found that moral outrage involves three distinct components: anger at the transgressor, contempt for their character or values, and disgust at the violation of the moral order. The combination of these three negative emotions, activated together, produces the specific motivational state that drives punishment behavior. Research by Jonathan Haidt and colleagues on moral emotion has found that moral outrage is the single most reliable predictor of punitive behavior across a wide range of social and legal contexts, more reliable than the assessment of harm magnitude, more reliable than the calculation of deterrence value. The outrage comes first. The justification follows. The just world belief, the deeply held, often pre-reflective assumption that the world is a place where people get what they deserve and deserve what they get, provides the moral framework within which revenge is experienced as not merely emotionally satisfying, but morally necessary. Research by Melvin Lerner on just world theory has found that the violation of this belief by witnessing unjustified harm to innocent people produces a specific and powerful dissonance that motivates belief-restoring action. When someone wrongs us and faces no consequence, the just world belief is violated. The person who deserved to be harmed was not harmed, and the wrongdoer who deserved to suffer did not suffer. Revenge, from the perspective of the just world belief, is not aggression. It is a correction of an injustice, a restoration of the moral order that the wrong disrupted. Counterfactual thinking, the mental simulation of how events could have unfolded differently, plays a specific and important role in revenge motivation. Research has found that upward counterfactuals, imagining better alternatives to what actually happened, are associated with elevated regret and, when applied to interpersonal harm, with elevated grievance and revenge motivation. The thought, if only they hadn't done this, generates the upward counterfactual of the world in which the harm did not occur, and the comparison between the actual world and the better counterfactual world amplifies both the sense of loss and the sense of injustice. Research has found that rumination, the repetitive, involuntary revisiting of the harmful event and its alternatives, is driven by and simultaneously drives counterfactual thinking, creating a self-sustaining cycle in which the mental simulation of the better world that should have been maintains and amplifies the motivation to punish the person who prevented it. Research has established a meaningful distinction between revenge and justice that the emotional intensity of revenge motivation can obscure. Revenge is personal, proportional to the transgressor's identity rather than to the transgression's severity, and oriented toward the wrongdoer's suffering as the desired outcome. Justice is impersonal, proportional to the transgression itself, and oriented toward the restoration of norms rather than toward any specific individual's pain. Research has found that people who believe they are seeking justice are often seeking revenge. The outcome they want is the wrongdoer's specific suffering, not the restoration of the norm the wrongdoer violated. The language of justice is applied retrospectively to a motivation that preceded it. The revenge was first. The justice reasoning was assembled afterward to give it a legitimate name. Research on victims' perceptions of moral entitlement has found that having been genuinely wronged activates a specific sense of moral license. The feeling that revenge is not only emotionally justified but morally permitted, even morally required. Research by Kevin Carlsmith and colleagues has found that victims genuinely believe that punishing the wrongdoer will provide closure and emotional relief. A prediction about future emotional states that research has consistently found to be wrong. The belief that revenge will provide relief is, research suggests, one of the most reliable examples of affective forecasting failure in human psychology. People overpredict how satisfying the punishment will feel and underpredict how little the satisfaction will resolve the underlying emotional state the harm produced. The moral entitlement to revenge is real. The emotional forecast attached to it is not. The distinction between retributive and restorative impulses in the aftermath of harm reflects a fundamental division in what the harmed person's psychology is actually seeking. The retributive impulse, the one most aligned with revenge, wants the wrongdoer to suffer in proportion to the suffering they caused. The restorative impulse wants the relationship to be repaired, the harm to be acknowledged, the norm to be restored. Research has found that these impulses are not always cleanly separated within a single person. The same persons may experience both simultaneously, with the retributive impulse running at full intensity in the acute aftermath and the restorative impulse becoming more accessible as emotional intensity diminishes over time. Understanding which impulse is driving the behavior at any given moment is one of the more practically useful distinctions the psychology of revenge provides. Research has found that revenge fantasies, the repetitive mental rehearsal of scenarios in which the wrongdoer suffers, serve a specific psychological function in the immediate aftermath of harm. They provide a sense of agency and control in a situation that the harm has made feel uncontrollable, and they allow the processing of the anger generated by the violation in a context that does not require action. Research has found that brief, occasional revenge fantasies shortly after a harm are common, normative, and not associated with subsequent problematic behavior. The clinical problem is not the existence of revenge fantasies, but their chronicity. When the fantasy becomes the primary mode of processing the harm rather than a temporary stage in the resolution of it, the result is the rumination maintenance cycle that keeps the wound active. The distinction between the anger response to harm and the revenge response is more than semantic. Research has found that anger, as a response to harm, is primarily oriented towards stopping the harm, at restoring safety and preventing future violation. Revenge motivation is oriented towards something else, the wrongdoer's suffering specifically, as a form of equalization. Research has found that these motivational states predict different behavioral responses and respond differently to intervention. Anger diminishes when the threat is removed or the person feels safe. Revenge motivation may intensify even when safety is restored, because what it wants is not safety. It wants the score to be even, and the score, as long as the wrongdoer is doing well while the victim suffers, is not even. Research has found that wrongs carried out in the absence of witnesses generate stronger negative emotional responses than comparable wrongs that occurred in public, a finding consistent with the reputation signaling account of revenge motivation. When a wrong is witnessed, social reality is jointly established. Others know what was done, the transgressor's reputation is affected, and the victim's account does not require independent validation. When the wrong is private, the victim faces the additional burden of being the sole witness to their own harm. With no external validation of their account, no social record of the transgression, and a sense of grievance that is invisible to the broader community. Research has found that this invisibility of harm intensifies the revenge motivation, partly because the absence of witnesses removes one of the mechanisms through which justice might be served without active pursuit. The first paradox of revenge is visible in the biology that supports it. The revenge impulse was designed to restore something: equity, dignity, the social order, the just world, that the revenge itself cannot actually restore. Punishing the wrongdoer does not undo the harm. It does not return what was taken or repair what was broken. It does not make the wrong not have happened. What it does, at best, is produce a new harm in the wrongdoer that is analogous in magnitude to the original, which restores the symmetry of suffering, but not the state of well-being that preceded the original harm. The brain's reward system responds to the prospect of this symmetrical suffering as though it were a genuine restoration of what was lost. The rest of the psychology, the research on what actually happens after revenge is enacted, reveals the distance between the promise of the response and what the response actually delivers. The sweetness of revenge lives entirely in its anticipation. Everything after is more complicated. The research begins where the anticipation ends. The neural circuitry of anticipated revenge centers on the dorsal striatum and specifically the caudate nucleus, a region whose role in the brain's reward architecture has been studied extensively in contexts ranging from food reward to financial gain to social status. The caudate nucleus tracks the expected reward value of anticipated actions, activates in anticipation of desired outcomes, and drives the goal-directed behavior aimed at obtaining them. In de Quervain's PET study, caudate activation during effective punishment decisions was significantly correlated with the self-reported desire to punish. The participants who reported the most intense desire to see the defector suffer showed the greatest neural reward signal when given the opportunity to deliver that suffering. The neural machinery does not distinguish between the anticipated pleasure of a valued meal, a financial windfall, or seeing someone who wronged you finally face consequences. It activates for all of them through the same basic circuitry, generating the same basic motivational pressure. What looks like a moral emotion from the perspective of the caudate nucleus looks like any other anticipated reward. The anticipation experience gap in revenge, the systematic discrepancy between how satisfying people predict revenge will be and how satisfying it turns out to be, represents one of the most well-documented cases of affective forecasting failure in the psychology literature. Affective forecasting, the human capacity to predict future emotional states, is known to be biased in specific ways. People overestimate both the intensity and the duration of future positive emotional responses to desired outcomes, partly because they focus on the target event in isolation without adequately accounting for the psychological processes that will occur alongside it. In the context of revenge, research has found that people who anticipate punishing a wrongdoer rate the predicted satisfaction highly, consistent with the caudate's reward signal that anticipation generates. Research tracking the actual emotional experience following revenge finds systematically lower reported satisfaction than was predicted, shorter duration of any positive emotional shift, and in many cases a return to negative affect shortly after the punitive act was completed. The gap between the anticipated sweetness and the experienced reality is not incidental. It is structurally built into how the brain processes anticipated and experienced reward differently. Research by Kevin Carlsmith and colleagues, published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, studied people's expectations about the emotional consequences of punishing a wrongdoer versus not pursuing punishment, and then measured what actually happened to their emotional state after taking each course of action. The central and counterintuitive finding was this: people who punished the wrongdoer did not think about the harmful incident less. They thought about it more. Those who did not punish moved on. Their mental engagement with the offense declined over time. Their emotional intensity diminished, and the harm progressively occupied less cognitive space. Those who punished continued to ruminate about the offender and the offense, maintaining the harm in active emotional and cognitive processing rather than allowing it to recede. Carlsmith and colleagues proposed that the act of punishment itself maintained the harm's cognitive salience. By framing the original wrong as an object of ongoing active attention, the punishment confirmed its status as something still requiring a response. rather than something that had been addressed and could be left behind. The mechanism through which revenge maintains, rather than resolves the wound, is the rumination maintenance cycle. Rumination, the repetitive, passive, self-focused engagement with distressing material, is both a driver and a consequence of the revenge motivation. The person ruminates, which intensifies the emotional response to the harm, which intensifies the desire for revenge, which keeps the harm cognitively active, which intensifies the rumination. Acting on the revenge impulse does not break this cycle. Research found that it may accelerate it. By confirming the harm's importance as an object of active attention, generating new cognitive content in the wrongdoer's response to the punishment and the adequacy of the outcome, and extending the emotional engagement with the original event rather than providing the endpoint the revenge was intended to create. The wound stays open because the behavior intended to close it keeps the wound in view. The catharsis hypothesis, the idea that expressing or enacting anger provides relief by discharging accumulated emotional pressure, is among the most intuitively compelling and most thoroughly empirically refuted propositions in psychology. In Bushman's 2002 study, angered participants hit a punching bag while thinking about the person who had angered them. Rather than reducing their anger, this venting increased it. Participants in the rumination and venting group reported higher anger, higher negative affect, and more aggressive intentions after hitting the punching bag than participants who simply sat quietly and did nothing. Doing nothing at all was more effective at reducing anger than venting. Bushman's study directly and unambiguously contradicted catharsis theory. Expressing anger through physical aggression while thinking about the source of the anger does not extinguish the flame. It feeds it. The hydraulic model of emotional energy, the idea that anger builds up and must be discharged, is a compelling metaphor and a false description of how the emotional system actually works. Research has found that acting on the revenge impulse often produces additional anger rather than depleting the anger that motivated it. The wrongdoer's response to the punishment is rarely exactly what the imagination scripted. They may not appear to suffer sufficiently, may not acknowledge the justice of the punishment, may respond with their own anger or denial. Each of these produces new emotional content that feels like a fresh extension of the original wrong. The anger that revenge was meant to extinguish is often fed by the same act that was meant to put it out. Brad Bushman's research has produced what researchers sometimes describe as the open-wound model of rumination and revenge. Engaging with the grievance through rumination, venting, or vengeful action maintains the wound in an active, metabolically costly state, while disengagement allows natural resolution processes to reduce its emotional intensity over time. A physical wound that is repeatedly touched and opened heals more slowly than one that is left to rest. The psychological wound of interpersonal harm shows an analogous pattern. Engagement with the harm through rumination and revenge keeps it active, preventing the natural attenuation of emotional response that time and distance from the material would otherwise allow. The wound stays fresh precisely because the impulse to address it keeps reopening it with each engagement. One of the psychological mechanisms through which revenge fails to provide its promised satisfaction is what researchers have called the moral superiority trap. When a person punishes a wrongdoer, they derive a genuine sense of moral superiority, a confirmation that they were the wronged party, the morally correct one, the person whose response was justified. This superiority is initially satisfying, but its maintenance requires the continued relevance of the original harm. The moral superiority exists specifically in relation to the wrongdoer's wrongness, and it cannot be sustained independently of that reference point. Research has found that the moral superiority derived from revenge can function as a motivation for maintaining the grievance rather than resolving it, because ending the grievance would also dissolve the moral position that the grievance provides. Research on attribution processes in the aftermath of harm has found that victims show systematic attribution biases that intensify their emotional response and maintain the grievance over time. The fundamental attribution error, the tendency to attribute others' behavior to stable dispositional characteristics rather than to situational factors, is amplified in the context of perceived harm. The wrongdoer's harmful action is attributed to their malicious character rather than to situational factors that might have influenced the behavior. Research has found that dispositional attributions intensify moral outrage because a dispositional attribution makes the act feel more deliberate and more revealing of who the person fundamentally is, and make forgiveness more difficult because forgiving a character flaw is structurally harder than forgiving a situational lapse. The story the mind constructs about why the harm occurred shapes both the emotional response to it and the perceived options for resolving it. Have you ever gone through with something you thought would make you feel better and found that it left you in exactly the same place or somewhere worse? Research on hindsight bias, the retrospective sense that events were more predictable and avoidable than they actually were, has found that this bias operates specifically in victim narratives in ways that deepen the grievance. In retrospect, the wrongdoer's action seems predictable, the warning signs seem obvious, and the failure to prevent the harm feels like culpable negligence. This retrospective predictability amplifies both the sense of injustice, the harm could have been prevented, and the anger at the person who must, in this retrospective reading, have knowingly and deliberately caused it. Research has found that hindsight bias in victim narratives systematically overstates the deliberateness of the harm, underestimates the genuine uncertainty that preceded it, and produces a version of the wrongdoer that is more calculating and more culpable than the evidence fully supports. Research on narrative and emotional regulation has found that the stories people construct and rehearse about interpersonal harms are among the most powerful mechanisms for maintaining or resolving grievances. The harm narrative, once constructed, provides a framework that organizes memory, selects for harm-consistent information, and validates and intensifies the emotional response to the original event each time it is revisited. Research has found that highly elaborated, consistently structured, repeatedly rehearsed harm narratives are associated with stronger revenge motivation, more intense negative affect, and lower likelihood of forgiveness than less elaborated accounts. The story of what was done to you, told and retold in its most injurious form, becomes a mechanism for maintaining the emotional reality of the harm long after the events themselves have receded in time. Research on counterfactual thinking and grievance has found a specific asymmetry, downward counterfactuals, imagining how things could have been worse, tend to produce gratitude and reduced distress. Upward counterfactuals, imagining how easily things could have been better, tend to produce regret, intensified injustice perception, and elevated revenge motivation. In the context of interpersonal harm, the dominant upward counterfactual takes the form, "If only they had chosen differently, none of this would have happened." Research has found that frequent upward counterfactual thinking about interpersonal harm is associated with higher revenge motivation, longer grievance duration, and greater difficulty with forgiveness. Because the upward counterfactual simultaneously confirms the injustice of the harm and the wrongdoer's sole responsibility for foreclosing the better alternative, the mind returns to the better world that should have been, and the person who prevented it is there every time. Have you ever replayed a wrong so many times in your mind that the replay itself became the injury, the original event less vivid than the version the mind had been building and rebuilding ever since? One of the most consistently documented features of revenge motivation is its orientation not only toward the wrongdoer's suffering, but toward their acknowledgement. Research has found that what victims most frequently report wanting is not simply punishment, but comprehension. For the wrongdoer to genuinely understand what the harm felt like from the inside, to acknowledge that it was real and serious, and to demonstrate that understanding through visible remorse. Research on victim satisfaction in both criminal and civil justice contexts has found that acknowledgement of harm is among the strongest predictors of victim satisfaction with the resolution outcome, while punishment alone, without acknowledgement, frequently fails to produce satisfaction. The revenge impulse contains within it an acknowledgement-seeking function that punishment alone, even severe punishment, cannot fulfill. Research has documented a specific and counterintuitive finding: the wrongdoer's indifference, their apparent lack of concern about the harm they caused, their unawareness of or indifference to the victim's suffering, is frequently reported as more painful than the original harm itself, and more persistently distressing than any specific punishment the wrongdoer might receive. This finding is consistent with the acknowledgement account. What the victim most needs is for the harm to be real to the wrongdoer, to be felt, registered, and taken seriously as significant. A punishment that reaches the wrongdoer's material circumstances while leaving their internal experience unmoved provides the outer form of justice without the inner substance that, for the victim, justice requires. The wrongdoer suffers but does not understand, and the understanding was what was being sought. Research on social sensitivity has found that people are remarkably accurate at detecting when they are being treated as less important, less valuable, or less worthy of consideration than they believe they deserve, even when no explicit harmful act has been committed. The perception of being overlooked, dismissed, or deliberately excluded activates neural and emotional responses comparable to more direct forms of harm and generates equivalent moral outrage and revenge motivation. Eisenberger's research on social exclusion found that being excluded from a group game activates brain regions associated with physical pain, suggesting that social harm is processed through overlapping neural architecture to physical injury. The harm detection system is not calibrated only for direct assault. It is calibrated for any treatment that signals inadequate social regard, and it generates the revenge motivation regardless of whether the harm was intended. Research on the physiological consequences of sustained negative emotion has found specific and measurable costs associated with the chronic anger, moral outrage, and rumination that sustained revenge motivation generates. Research on hostility and health by Williams and colleagues found that chronic hostility, the persistent emotional orientation toward threat and interpersonal harm, is among the strongest psychological predictors of cardiovascular disease. Sustained revenge motivation represents a specific form of chronic hostility, an ongoing threat appraisal directed at a specific person sustained over time by rumination and grievance rehearsal. The body runs the threat response continuously, accumulating the physiological costs of an emergency that is never resolved. Research on the relationship between unforgiveness and physical health has found that states of resentment, bitterness, and sustained revenge motivation produce elevated cortisol, elevated blood pressure, elevated heart rate, and elevated pro-inflammatory cytokine levels compared to conditions of forgiveness, with longitudinal research associating high trait unforgiveness with poorer immune function and higher morbidity. The physiological system does not distinguish between the stress of external physical threat and the stress of an internal emotional orientation organized around harm. Either way, the same machinery runs and the same price is paid daily. Every day the grievance is maintained is a day the body pays the cost of the original harm again. Research on meaning-making in the aftermath of harm has found that the failure to integrate a harm into a coherent account of the self and its place in the world is among the strongest predictors of ongoing rumination and revenge motivation. When a harm cannot be made sense of, when it sits in the person's experience as an open, unprocessed event, the mind continues to turn it over in an attempt to complete the sense-making that would allow the processing to conclude. Research has found that meaning-making is not the same as justifying or excusing the harm. It is the construction of a coherent account of how the harm happened and what the person's life can be in its aftermath. Without this account, the processing runs indefinitely, and the rumination that feeds and maintains the revenge motivation runs with it. Research comparing imagined and enacted revenge has found a specific pattern. Imagined revenge produces a brief positive emotional shift followed by a rapid return to baseline. Enacted revenge produces a pattern that is, on average, less satisfying than imagined revenge and more likely to produce ongoing negative affect. For the reasons Carl Smith's research documented, the act maintains the harm's salience, generates new cognitive content, and fails to deliver the script that the imagination had developed. The gap between the imagined version and the enacted version is partly explained by the wrongdoer's real response, which is rarely what the imagination scripted, and partly by the inherent complexity of real outcomes compared to the clean resolution that fantasy provides. Research on affective forecasting has described the failure of revenge to deliver its promised emotional relief as a case of the impact bias. The systematic overestimation of the emotional impact of future events. In the specific context of revenge, the impact bias operates along two dimensions. People overestimate how much the punishment will hurt the wrongdoer and how much relief delivering the punishment will provide for themselves. Both predictions are systematically inaccurate in the same direction. The satisfaction anticipated is larger than the satisfaction delivered. The resolution expected is thinner, shorter, and more complicated than the anticipation produced. The system was built for the pursuit. It was not built with an equivalent mechanism to recognize when the pursuit has delivered what it promised. Because it never fully does, the system was built for pursuing, not for the arrival. And when the wrong is deep enough, the pursuing never stops. Research has established that traumatic experiences, events that overwhelm the person's capacity to process and integrate what occurred, produce specific and measurable elevations in revenge cognitions that persist well beyond the acute aftermath of the harm. The mechanism is consistent with the broader trauma literature. Traumatic events that are not adequately processed remain in a state of active threat level arousal, continuously triggering the defensive and punitive responses that the original threat mobilized. Research has found that trauma survivors show elevated revenge motivation, more intense desire for punishment, and more persistent and intrusive revenge-related cognitions than people who experienced equivalent harm without the traumatic quality. The revenge motivation in trauma is not simply a response to what happened. It is part of the ongoing processing attempt for an event the mind has not yet been able to integrate. The punitive impulse running continuously alongside the unresolved event that produced it. Research on post-traumatic stress disorder has found a specific relationship between PTSD symptom severity and revenge cognitions. Studies measuring PTSD symptom severity and concurrent revenge motivation have found significant positive correlations. Higher symptom severity predicts more intense and more intrusive revenge-related cognitions, and intrusive revenge fantasies are among the symptoms most commonly reported by trauma survivors across populations and trauma types. Research has found that revenge cognitions in PTSD function partly as intrusive re-experiencing symptoms. Involuntary mental events that arrive without invitation rather than purely as deliberate motivational states. The mind returns to the scene of the harm and in the process of returning generates the punitive response that the harm originally activated. The fantasy was not chosen. It arrives uninvited, carrying the full emotional charge of the original event. Jennifer Fried's research on betrayal trauma has established that harms committed by people in positions of trust, intimate partners, parents, close friends, institutions that were depended upon, generate a qualitatively different psychological response from harms committed by strangers or recognized adversaries. Research has found that traumas high in betrayal are significantly more strongly associated with PTSD symptoms, anxiety, depression, and dissociation than traumas low in betrayal, even when threat level is controlled. The betrayal trauma response is organized around the violation of the attachment bond as much as around the harm itself, and the revenge motivation it generates carries a specific additional quality, not only the desire to punish, but the desire for the trusted person to understand what the betrayal cost, to acknowledge that the relationship they destroyed had real value, and to demonstrate genuine comprehension of what was lost. Research has found that betrayal trauma generates more durable revenge motivation and is more resistant to ordinary resolution processes because the harm came from exactly the source that resolution would normally require. Research on attachment and interpersonal harm has found that harm by an attachment figure, a person to whom the injured party was emotionally bonded, generates a particularly persistent and cognitively complex form of revenge motivation. The attachment system, which evolved to maintain proximity to protective others, produces heightened activation specifically when the attachment figure becomes a source of threat rather than safety. When the person who was meant to provide security delivers harm instead, the resulting psychological state involves simultaneous activation of both the attachment impulse and the threat response, an unresolvable tension between the need for the relationship and the anger at its violation. Research has found that this conflicting activation produces more intense rumination, greater difficulty with cognitive processing, and more durable revenge motivation than non-attachment harm, because the need for the attachment figure's acknowledgement and understanding remains active even while the rage at their betrayal is also running at full capacity. The most durable revenge motivations are those carrying the shadow of a relationship that should have been safe. Research on shame and revenge has found that shame, the global negative evaluation of the self that severe harm often produces, functions as one of the most powerful fuels of the revenge impulse. When harm produces not only pain, but the specific self-directed diminishment that shame involves. Something about me made this possible. I am the one who can be treated this way. The revenge motivation carries an additional layer. It is not only a response to the wrongdoer's act, but an attempt to externalize the shame back toward the person who generated it. If the wrongdoer can be made to suffer visibly, if their diminishment can be made public, the verdict of the shame, I am the one who was made small, can be at least temporarily reversed. Research has found that the most intense and most persistent revenge motivations are often organized around shame as much as around material harm, The harm that left the person feeling small is the harm that most powerfully activates the desire to make the wrongdoer small in return. Revenge is, in this reading, shame converted into a project. Research on the phenomenology of enacted revenge has consistently documented the insufficiency experience. The feeling, after the punishment has been delivered, that it was not quite enough. The wrongdoer did not suffer sufficiently. The equity was not fully restored. Something more is required. This feeling is not incidental. It is structurally produced by the mechanism through which revenge attempts to satisfy. The subjective experience of harm is always larger, more personal, and more intentional than any punishment it motivated, making strict proportional equivalence structurally impossible and making any specific punishment feel like an underestimate of what was actually deserved. Research has found that the insufficiency experience is one of the primary drivers of revenge escalation. Each act of revenge that fails to satisfy generates the motivation for a more intense act, with the scale of the required punishment escalating alongside the sense that nothing yet delivered has been quite sufficient. The ratchet effect in revenge describes the self-reinforcing cycle through which each insufficient act of revenge motivates the next, while each act that appears proportional tends to generate a counter-revenge response in the wrongdoer that restores the imbalance. Research on conflict escalation has found a consistent and important asymmetry. Parties in revenge cycles reliably perceive their own retaliatory actions as more proportional than the actions that provoked them. Each party believes their response was the measured, appropriate response to an excessive provocation. This asymmetric proportionality perception means that what feels like equivalent retaliation to the retaliator feels like fresh escalation to the target, who then responds with what they perceive as a proportional response to the perceived escalation which the original retaliator experiences as a new provocation. The ratchet clicks upward with each cycle, producing the escalating patterns that characterize family feuds, institutional conflicts, and, at scale, geopolitical violence. The logic of revenge scales from the individual to the group with minimal structural change. Research on intergroup conflict has found that groups respond to harm from outgroups using the same basic cognitive and emotional processes that individuals show in interpersonal harm: elevated moral outrage, dispositional attribution of the harm to the outgroup's collective character, activation of the punitive impulse, and systematic overestimation of the justification for retaliation. The group adds additional amplifying mechanisms: social validation of the grievance by in-group members, the mobilization of shared emotional states that produce collective outrage, and the diffusion of individual responsibility that allows group members to participate in collective punishment they might not undertake alone. Research has found that the same affective forecasting failures that characterize individual revenge, the overestimation of how satisfying the punishment will be, the maintenance of grievance after punishment is delivered, operate at the group level, where the consequences of these predictable failures are scaled accordingly. The escalation requires a story, and the story requires the other side to stop being a person. Research on dehumanization has found that the punitive impulse, and particularly its escalation toward extreme severity, is consistently facilitated by the progressive reduction of the wrongdoer's perceived humanity. Research by Nick Haslam and colleagues has identified two forms of dehumanization: animalistic dehumanization, which denies the refined, civilized qualities considered specifically human, and mechanistic dehumanization, which denies warmth, emotion, and the capacity for genuine suffering. Both forms facilitate harm toward those who are dehumanized by removing the empathic constraint that ordinarily limits punishment to proportional response. In revenge cycles, particularly at the group level, dehumanization provides the psychological permission structure for escalating severity. Each iteration of the cycle produces dehumanizing representations of the other that make the next iteration easier to justify and harder to limit. Research by Richard Nisbett and Dov Cohen on honor culture norms has documented the social architecture through which revenge becomes not merely permitted but morally obligatory. In their experimental studies, Southern American men who were bumped and insulted showed significantly greater cortisol and testosterone reactivity than Northern controls, were more cognitively primed for aggressive responses, and were more likely to behave aggressively and dominantly following the insult. Nisbett and Cohen's analysis of honor culture found that its central organizing principle is the reputation defense imperative. In environments where reputation for toughness is a genuine deterrent to exploitation, and where formal institutions cannot be relied upon for protection, the failure to retaliate against a serious wrong signals weakness and invites further aggression. The honor culture does not permit revenge. It constructs it as the socially obligated response, the response without which the violated person standing in the community cannot be restored. Research on identity and grievance has documented a specific and clinically important transition, the point at which revenge motivation shifts from an episodic response to a persistent harm to a fundamental feature of the self-concept. When the person is no longer someone who was wronged and wants justice but has become, at the level of identity, someone who has been wronged. This transition is marked by specific changes. The grievance becomes the primary lens through which new experiences are filtered. Social relationships are evaluated in terms of their relationship to the original wrong, and the self-narrative is organized around the harm and the perpetrator as central characters. Research has found that once revenge motivation has been incorporated into identity, it is significantly more resistant to intervention, because what is being challenged is no longer a motivation but a fundamental self-defining story. And the loss of the grievance would also be the loss of the identity organized around it. Research tracking grievance motivation over time has found that revenge motivation can be sustained over years and decades through the ruminative processes that maintain it acutely. Longitudinal research has found that individuals who do not achieve meaningful resolution of interpersonal harm through acknowledgement, restitution, forgiveness, or successful meaning-making show persistent levels of revenge motivation that do not decline at the rate that the passage of time alone would predict. Rumination keeps the grievance current. Each time the harmful event is recalled, emotionally rehearsed, and re-experienced, the emotional intensity is partially restored towards something close to its original level. The memory does not follow the normal trajectory of emotional attenuation because it is continuously refreshed by the ruminative processing that the unresolved grievance generates and sustains. Research has found a specific and clinically important relationship between unprocessed grief and revenge motivation. Grief, the process of coming to terms with loss, and revenge, the impulse to punish the person responsible, are not always separate responses. They are frequently competing orientations to the same harm or sequential phases of the same response. Research has found that individuals who cannot tolerate the grief associated with an interpersonal harm, the lost relationship, the lost sense of safety, the lost future that the harm foreclosed, frequently convert the grief into revenge motivation. The sorrow that cannot be sustained is replaced by the anger that feels more active, more powerful, and less helpless than grief requires the person to be. The grief to revenge conversion maintains the wound in an active, motivated state rather than allowing the processing of loss that grief, when it can be tolerated, eventually produces. Research comparing anger-dominated and grief-dominated responses to interpersonal harm has found systematically different psychological trajectories. Anger-dominated responses are associated with higher revenge motivation, higher rumination, greater difficulty with forgiveness, and longer maintenance of elevated physiological stress. Grief-dominated responses are associated with more effective emotional processing, greater meaning-making, and better long-term adjustment, including higher rates of post-traumatic growth. The critical distinction is that grief is oriented toward the loss itself. It processes what is gone, acknowledges it, and eventually allows a relationship with the reality the loss created. Anger is oriented toward the wrongdoer. It keeps the attention on the source of the harm and the need to address it, preventing the processing of loss that grief would otherwise permit. Grief moves through the loss. Anger circles the person who caused it. They are not the same journey. Research on the psychology of litigation has found that people pursue legal action with explicit expectations of emotional relief. The belief that a verdict, financial award, or criminal conviction will provide the resolution the harm left incomplete. Research has found these expectations to be consistently and substantially disappointed. Plaintiffs who win civil cases and crime victims who see their perpetrators convicted frequently report lower satisfaction with the outcome than they anticipated, and many report that the litigation process intensified rather than resolved their distress. The legal system establishes facts, assigns liability, and imposes penalties. It is not designed to produce the acknowledgement, remorse, and comprehension in the wrongdoer that research has found victims actually need from a resolution. The empty verdict, the legal outcome that is formally a victory. while providing none of the emotional resolution the victory was expected to produce, is among the most consistently reported experiences in litigation psychology research. Plaintiffs who prevail describe emotional flatness, renewed grief, and a persistent grievance the verdict did not affect. The wrongdoer was found liable, the compensation was awarded, and the interior experience of the harm remained unchanged. Research suggests this outcome is structurally predicted by what victims actually seek. The legal verdict establishes what was done, but it cannot require the wrongdoer to feel what was done. The jury found against them. They may leave the courtroom having never genuinely understood what the harm cost the person they caused it to. The verdict was empty of the thing it was most sought for, when the actual target of revenge motivation is inaccessible because they have died, moved beyond reach, occupy a protected institutional position, or simply cannot be found. Research has found that the motivation does not dissolve. It seeks a substitute. The substitute may be a person associated with the original wrongdoer, a representative of the institution that failed to protect, or an accessible member of the category to which the wrongdoer belongs. Research on displaced aggression has found that the target substitution process is largely unconscious. The person does not typically recognize they are enacting revenge against a substitute. The emotion is redirected. The original wound remains. Displaced revenge, the enactment of retributive behavior against someone who did not cause the original harm, is documented across individual, relational, and institutional contexts. Research has found that displaced revenge is associated with the severity and persistence of the unresolved original grievance. The larger and more durable the wound, the more broadly the revenge motivation generalizes, and the more readily it discharges against available targets. Partners, children, subordinates, and strangers absorb the cost of harms they had no part in creating, because they are present when the original motivation activates and the original target is not. The displaced revenge does not address the wound. It distributes its cost. Research on personality and grievance maintenance has described the pattern of grievance collecting. The accumulation of multiple unresolved wrongs over time into a worldview organized around injustice and the persistent sense of being a target. The grievance collector does not process harms as discrete events to be resolved. They accumulate them as evidence of a general truth, that the world is hostile, that they are its persistent target, and that those who have wronged them are organized in their wrongdoing. Research has found that grievance collecting is associated with elevated paranoid ideation and a specific attentional style highly sensitive to perceived slights, highly resistant to evidence that the perceived slights were unintentional, and increasingly oriented toward the catalog of past injustices as confirmation of present threat. The collection grows. The resolution of any item in it remains perpetually incomplete. The most clinically consequential finding in the psychology of revenge is the simplest: the revenge impulses, when sustained and organized into the person's cognitive and emotional life through rumination and identity, does not maintain the wound in service of eventual healing. it maintains it as a permanent feature of the present. The harm in the mind organized around revenge is not a past event moving toward resolution. It is a current state of affairs held in continuous active processing. The organizing center around which present experience is structured. Research on the temporal orientation of sustained revenge motivation has found that it is characteristically non-progressive, not moving from the harm toward a future in which the harm is past, but circling it continuously, returning to it as the event that cannot be left behind because the response to it has not yet been completed. The wrong stays present tense. The mind that rehearses the response to it cannot afford to let it become past tense. The past tense of a wrong is what healing looks like. Revenge keeps it present, and keeping it present has a cost. Research has measured it carefully. Research has found consistent and strong positive associations between sustained revenge motivation, including chronic unforgiveness, persistent grievance rehearsal, and the ongoing desire to punish a wrongdoer, and depressive symptoms. McCullough's longitudinal research on vengefulness found that vengeful individuals reported more intense rumination about the offense, higher negative affectivity, and significantly lower life satisfaction than their less vengeful counterparts, with vengefulness accounting for a substantial portion of the variance in rumination that maintained the revenge motivation over time. The mechanism operates through multiple overlapping pathways. The ruminative cognitive style that maintains revenge motivation is itself one of the strongest established predictors of depression. The chronic negative affect generated by persistent grievance rehearsal depletes the positive emotional resources that buffer against it, and the characteristic orientation toward a past event rather than toward present engagement and future possibility produces the narrowed attentional focus and reduced hedonic capacity that depressive states involve. Research has found that interventions reducing revenge motivation produce measurable reductions in depressive symptoms as a secondary outcome, providing evidence for the directional relationship. Research has found specific and robust associations between revenge cognitions and sleep disruption through the same pre-sleep rumination mechanism documented in anxiety and perfectionism research, with revenge-specific content replacing performance-related content as the activating material. Research on anger rumination and sleep has found that ruminating about interpersonal conflicts before sleep significantly increases sleep onset latency, reduces sleep quality, and produces more frequent nighttime awakenings. The content of revenge-motivated pre-sleep rumination, reviewing the harm in detail, rehearsing arguments, constructing mental scripts of confrontation or punishment, activates the sympathetic nervous system in ways that directly antagonize the parasympathetic regulation that sleep requires. Research has found that sleep disruption, once established, reciprocally intensifies negative affect and reduces the cognitive control capacity that would otherwise moderate the rumination, producing the cycle in which grievance disrupts sleep and disrupted sleep intensifies grievance. Research measuring cortisol in individuals instructed to recall people who had wronged them found elevated salivary cortisol compared to neutral and positive recall conditions, with unforgiving thoughts producing significantly higher brow electromyogram activity, skin conductance, heart rate, and blood pressure changes from baseline, effects that persisted after the imagery period into recovery periods. Research tracking cortisol in individuals high in trait unforgiveness over time has found elevated baseline cortisol and the flattened diurnal cortisol variation associated with chronic stress, a pattern found across multiple populations to predict adverse physical health outcomes. Chronic elevations in cortisol have negative effects on cardiovascular, immune, and brain systems, and potentially increase the risk for diabetes, hypertension, and immune system deficiency. The HPA axis responds to the interpersonal threat, represented by the rehearsed grievance with the same hormonal cascade it deploys in response to physical threat. The grievance is chronic. The cortisol response is chronic with it. Research on unforgiveness and immune function has found elevated pro-inflammatory cytokine levels, including interleukin-6 and tumor necrosis factor, alpha, in individuals with high-trait unforgiveness, consistent with the chronic low-grade inflammation pattern associated with chronic psychosocial stress. Research has found that forgiveness interventions that successfully reduce trait unforgiveness produce concurrent reductions in inflammatory markers, providing evidence for the directional relationship between the sustained grievance state and its immunological consequences. The immune system that is chronically oriented toward fighting an interpersonal threat that cannot be physically resolved pays the same price as one fighting any other unresolvable stressor. Progressive dysregulation of the inflammatory response that elevates risk for inflammatory disease processes across time. The body does not know the difference between a physical threat and a rehearsed one. It responds to both. Research on the relational consequences of sustained revenge motivation has found that one of its most significant costs is the generalization of the wrongdoer's characteristics to people who share their role or category. Significant interpersonal harms, particularly betrayal traumas, are associated with reduced trust in people who share characteristics with the wrongdoer. The same gender, the same institutional position, the same relational category. The partner who was betrayed may have difficulty trusting subsequent partners. The person harmed by an institution may have difficulty trusting comparable institutions. Research has found that this generalization is an adaptive short-term response, a protective recalibration of threat detection following a genuine violation that becomes maladaptive when it persists beyond the context that generated it, converting the defense against a specific person who caused harm into a defense against entire categories of people who have not. The specific cost of sustained revenge motivation to current intimate relationships extends beyond the generalization of distrust. Research has found that individuals with high trait unforgiveness show lower relationship satisfaction, higher relational conflict, and reduced trust in their current partners, even when those partners have not been the source of any harm. The vigilance for betrayal that sustained revenge motivation installs, the heightened sensitivity to signals of unreliability, deception, or insufficient care produces false positives in current relationships, generating accusations and defensive reactions that the relationship does not warrant. Research has found that the person who was most harmed in a past relationship frequently generates higher rates of relational difficulty in subsequent ones, not through intent, but through the perceptual and emotional apparatus the past harm installed, and that no subsequent relationship has been permitted to update. Research on victimhood identity and self-concept has found that organizing the self-narrative around the experience of having been wronged produces specific distortions in how the person understands their own agency, capacity, and possibilities. Chronic victim identity provides a coherent narrative framework for organizing experience, one that is genuinely validated by the reality of the harm, but that, when sustained beyond the acute processing period, progressively restricts the perceived self. Research has found that chronic victim identity is associated with reduced perceived agency, lower self-efficacy, and a characteristic attribution style that assigns causal responsibility for errant difficulties to external perpetrators rather than to conditions that might be addressable through personal action. The wrong done to the person becomes the explanation for everything that has not gone well since. The wrongdoer remains at the center of a story they are no longer actively participating in. Research on moral licensing has found that having been genuinely wronged activates a sense of moral credit, the implicit feeling that one's status as a victim provides permission for behaviors that would otherwise be considered unacceptable. Research has found that people who have been treated unfairly show higher rates of subsequent harmful behavior toward uninvolved third parties, with the license for this behavior implicitly drawn from the moral credit generated by having been victimized. In the context of revenge, moral licensing produces a specific pattern. The genuine wrong done to the person provides psychological permission for retaliatory behavior, whose severity progressively exceeds what any proportional response would justify, and the accumulation of moral credit from victimhood allows the escalation to continue without the internal challenge that the person's own ethical framework might otherwise produce. The person who was genuinely wronged uses the reality of that wrong as permission for new wrongs they do not fully account for. Revenge does not only keep you tied to the person who hurt you. Over time, it makes you more like them. Research on the psychological effects of pursuing revenge over time has found that the sustained orientation toward punishing a wrongdoer progressively changes the character of the pursuer in ways that are rarely noticed from the inside. Research has found that individuals who maintain revenge motivation over extended periods show increases in hostility, decreases in dispositional empathy, greater willingness to harm uninvolved people in pursuit of their objectives, and reduced capacity for the trust and openness that genuine relationships require. The person who began the pursuit as someone who had been wronged and wanted justice, progressively becomes someone whose primary orientation toward the world is adversarial. The revenge does not only consume time and emotional resources, it costs the person the qualities, openness, trust, empathic engagement that make the relationships and experiences that would fill the recovered time and energy possible. Research has consistently found that the inability to forgive, the sustained maintenance of resentment, bitterness, and revenge motivation is associated with poorer physical and psychological health outcomes across multiple dimensions. Worthington's research on forgiveness and health found that unforgiving thoughts produce significantly higher physiological stress responses than forgiving thoughts, with skin conductance, heart rate, and blood pressure elevations persisting into recovery periods. Longitudinal research has found that trait unforgiveness predicts higher rates of anxiety, depression, hostility, and substance use, and in some populations, higher rates of cardiovascular events. Research has found that forgiveness interventions, structured processes for replacing toxic resentment with more neutral or compassionate orientations, produce measurable reductions in physiological stress markers, psychological distress, and self-reported health complaints. The research finding is not that forgiveness is morally required. It is that the physiological and psychological cost of its absence is borne entirely by the person who cannot achieve it. One of the most consistently documented and clinically important paradoxes of revenge motivation is its effect on the psychological relationship between the victim and the wrongdoer. The person who was harmed and wants the wrongdoer to suffer has not moved away from the wrongdoer. They have maintained an intense, emotion-laden, cognitively prominent bond with exactly the person they most want to be free of. Research has found that sustained revenge motivation produces a paradoxical intimacy with the wrongdoer. The wrongdoer occupies significant psychological space, appears regularly in the person's thoughts, and functions as a primary reference point for the interpretation of new experiences. The person who most urgently wants to be rid of the wrongdoer is, through the very intensity of the revenge motivation, least able to achieve that freedom. Revenge is not the severance of the bond. It is one of the most powerful forms of maintaining it. Research on the cognitive resources consumed by sustained revenge motivation has found that rumination and grievance rehearsal are among the most resource-intensive mental activities. Engaging working memory, emotional processing capacity, and the attentional resources that would otherwise be available for present engagement, creative work, and future-oriented goals. McCullough's research found that vengeful individuals maintained higher rumination and lower life satisfaction over an 8-week follow-up, with the maintenance of revenge motivation accounting for a significant portion of the variance in sustained rumination. Research has found that rumination specifically reduces the availability of cognitive resources for the problem-solving, creative thinking, and positive social engagement most strongly associated with well-being. The years spent rehearsing the wrong are years in which those resources were unavailable for anything else. Research on the psychology of legal proceedings has documented secondary traumatization. Psychological harm produced not by the original injury, but by the process of pursuing justice through the legal system. Victims who pursue criminal prosecution or civil litigation frequently report that the litigation process involved repeated exposure to detailed accounts of their harm, public scrutiny of their credibility, cross-examination that felt adversarial to their account of their own experience, and a legal framework organized around the abstract determination of liability rather than the personal reality of what occurred. Research has found that litigation frequently produces deterioration in psychological well-being during the process, not improvement, and that the adversarial structure of legal proceedings can re-traumatize the people who enter them expecting validation and relief. The process of seeking the institutional form of revenge can produce a secondary harm comparable in some cases to the original. The harm does not stay contained to the person it was done to. It spreads through every relationship they have. Research on the social consequences of sustained grievance orientation has found measurable effects on the immediate social networks of people who organize their lives around revenge motivation. Children of parents with sustained, active revenge motivation show higher rates of anxiety, lower trust in social relationships, and higher rates of their own revenge-motivated behavior. Partners of people consumed by grievance report lower relationship satisfaction, secondary emotional burden, and the specific experience of being unable to provide what is needed, because what is needed is the resolution of something they had no part in causing. Research has found that sustained grievance orientation is among the conditions most strongly associated with secondary traumatization in close social networks. The people who love the person who was wronged absorb a share of the cost they did not incur. The identity cost of sustained revenge motivation is in some ways the most significant. Research on identity and long-term grievance has found that people who organize their self-concept around having been wronged progressively lose access to the parts of the self that were not defined by that wrong. The interests, relationships, sources of meaning, and capacities that existed before the harm and would be available after it if the person could reach them. The identity organized around the grievance crowds out other identities. The person who was wronged was also someone before being wronged, with a specific relationship to their own life, to possibility, to other people, and sustained revenge motivation makes that person progressively less accessible to themselves. Research has documented cases in which revenge motivation becomes not merely persistent but life-organizing, the primary frame around which daily activity, relationships, and long-term planning are structured. The person whose primary purpose is the pursuit of revenge has donated the organizational framework of their life to the person who harmed them, giving the wrongdoer a central and permanent role in the structure of their existence that no healthy relationship was ever given. Research has found that total organization of life around grievance is associated with the most severe outcomes across all measures of well-being, relational functioning, and physical health. The person has allowed the wrong to consume the life it was done to. Research has found that the person who carries active, sustained revenge motivation into a new intimate relationship brings a perceptual and emotional apparatus built to detect and respond to the specific harm that was done before, that produces systematic false positives in the new context. Research on relational patterns following betrayal has found that high unforgiveness individuals show higher rates of conflict initiation, lower rates of effective conflict repair, more difficulty with vulnerability disclosure, and higher rates of relationship dissolution than low unforgiveness individuals. The person most harmed in a past relationship frequently experiences higher rates of difficulty in subsequent ones, not because they attract harmful people, but because the protective system they built in response to past harm functions as a self-fulfilling relational prophecy. Research on social functioning and sustained grievance has found that the isolation associated with it is not only a consequence of time and energy consumed by rumination, it is also produced by the specific social behaviors that sustained vigilance for harm generates: reduced self-disclosure, higher defensive reactivity in interpersonal interactions, lower tolerance for the normal ambiguities of relationship, and the progressive narrowing of the social circle to those who validate the grievance rather than challenge it. Research has found that sustained revenge motivation is associated with lower perceived social support, not primarily because others withdraw from the person who was harmed, but because the person who was harmed progressively withdraws from the conditions under which genuine support becomes available. Research on the long-term psychological effects of maintaining revenge motivation has found costs that extend into the ethical self-concept. Sustaining the revenge orientation requires maintaining the representation of the wrongdoer as purely malicious, resisting the complexity and ambivalence that genuine perspective-taking might produce, because complexity would undermine the moral clarity that the revenge motivation requires. Research has found that this maintenance of moral certainty progressively reduces the capacity for the empathic perspective-taking that genuine moral reasoning requires. The person who set out to punish evil has, through the requirements of the pursuit, become less capable of seeing it clearly and less capable of the moral nuance that distinguishes justice from its imitation. The experiences most strongly associated with a meaningful and satisfying life: deep relationships, creative and professional engagement, genuine presence in current experience, contribution to something beyond the self, all require the cognitive and emotional resources that sustained revenge motivation chronically depletes. The years spent organizing the self around a grievance are years during which deep relationships were not built because the vigilance for harm prevented the vulnerability they require. The creative and professional work was not done because the rumination consumed the resources it would have needed. The presence in current life was not available because the attention was organized around a past event. The cost of revenge is not only what it takes, it is what it prevents, and what it prevents is the life that might have been built in the space that the grievance occupied. The grievance took up space. What was never built in that space is the cost that revenge does not advertise, but the space can be recovered. Research on what actually works has been specific about how. Research has established a meaningful distinction between what genuine justice accomplishes and what revenge attempts. Justice, in its restorative, procedurally fair form, addresses the harm as a violation of norms and relationships that can be acknowledged, repaired, and learned from. Revenge addresses the harm as a personal violation requiring personal suffering in the wrongdoer as payment. Research has found that the psychological outcomes of genuine justice differ substantially from the outcomes of revenge, even when the material consequences for the wrongdoer are similar. What distinguishes them is the element of acknowledgement. Genuine justice, in most of its effective forms, includes recognition of the harm as real, specific, and unjust, something that affected a real person and that the institutional response registers as such. Revenge can occur without any acknowledgement at all, and the research consistently finds that the acknowledgement is where the healing lives, not the suffering that accompanies it. Research has found that the most important factor in victim recovery following interpersonal harm is not the severity of the punishment imposed on the wrongdoer, but the degree to which the harm was acknowledged by the wrongdoer, by witnesses, by authorities, or by trusted others. Research on victim satisfaction and psychological recovery has consistently found that harm that was genuinely acknowledged, met with recognition, remorse, and accepted responsibility, produces better psychological outcomes than equivalent or greater harm that was punished without acknowledgement. The acknowledgement addresses what the victim most centrally needs: confirmation that the harm was real, that the wrongdoer understood what they did, and that the victim's account of the experience is valid. Punishment addresses the wrongdoer's material situation. Acknowledgement addresses the victim's psychological one. Research has found these to be different problems with different solutions, and only one of them is actually the victim's. A meta-analysis examining 35 restorative justice programs across 22 studies found that the vast majority of victims were significantly more satisfied with restorative justice processes than with the traditional justice system. Restorative justice, the facilitated process that brings together the harmed person, the person responsible, and relevant community members in a structured dialogue aimed at acknowledgement, accountability, and repair, consistently produced higher victim satisfaction, higher rates of reported emotional resolution, and higher restitution compliance than matched retributive justice cases. Research has found that victims who participate in restorative processes report feeling heard, respected, and able to ask the questions that a conviction cannot answer. Why did you do this? Did you understand what it did to me? Do you take genuine responsibility for what happened? These are the questions the revenge impulse was always generating. Restorative justice is one of the few processes designed to actually answer them. Research using neuroimaging and physiological measurement has found that receiving a genuine apology, one that includes specific acknowledgement of the harm, expression of remorse, and clear acceptance of responsibility, produces measurable changes in brain activation consistent with threat reduction. Research has found that genuine apology reception is associated with diminished activity in the amygdala and anterior insula, regions associated with threat detection and negative emotional processing, and increased activity in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, a region associated with the modulation of threat response and social cognitive processing. The genuine apology is not merely symbolic. It is a social signal processed by the nervous system as a genuine reduction in threat, altering not only the cognitive assessment of the situation, but the physiological state of the person who receives it. This is why an apology can do what a verdict cannot. It reaches the nervous system directly. Michael McCullough's longitudinal research on forgiveness and its relationship to well-being has found that forgiveness is fundamentally a motivational shift, a reduction in the motivation to avoid the transgressor and to seek revenge, and an increase in motivations toward conciliation and goodwill. In 3 longitudinal studies examining the relationship between rumination, emotion, and forgiveness, McCullough found that increased rumination about an offense correlated with temporary declines in forgiveness, showing that greater rumination leads to higher avoidance and revenge motivation over time, while compassionate reappraisal coping immediately prompted greater empathy and emotional forgiveness. His research has found forgiveness associated with significant improvements in well-being, reductions in depression and anxiety, and reductions in stress-related physical symptoms across multiple samples and follow-up periods. Research has confirmed that empathy toward the transgressor is the most salient psychological factor in the transition from revenge motivation to forgiveness, and that empathy, unlike the circumstances of the harm, is something the victim has meaningful influence over. Forgiveness is not a gift to the person who wronged you. Research has found it is almost entirely a gift to yourself. Worthington's research has distinguished 2 forms of forgiveness with different mechanisms and different timelines. Decisional forgiveness is the explicit commitment to change behavioral intentions toward the transgressor, to stop pursuing revenge, and to treat the person with basic decency, independent of how one currently feels. Emotional forgiveness is the deeper replacement of the unforgiving emotions, resentment, bitterness, hostility, and fear, with more positive or neutral emotional states through genuine processing of the harm. Research has found that decisional forgiveness can be achieved relatively quickly through deliberate commitment, but does not change the underlying emotional state that drives the physiological stress costs of unforgiveness. Emotional forgiveness takes longer and requires a different kind of work, engaging the emotional reality of the harm, developing empathic understanding of the transgressor's perspective, and the altruistic willingness to give something the transgressor may not deserve. Both forms produce measurable benefits. They are not the same process, and conflating them produces the confusion of people who have decided to forgive, but find the body has not yet complied. One of the most practically important distinctions in the forgiveness research literature is the distinction between forgiveness and reconciliation. Forgiveness is a change in the victim's own internal motivational state, the reduction of resentment and the replacement of negative emotion with something more neutral or compassionate. Reconciliation is the restoration of the relationship between the two parties. Research has consistently and unambiguously found that forgiveness does not require reconciliation, and that reconciliation is not necessary for forgiveness to produce its full well-being benefits. A person can forgive, can release the revenge motivation, reduce the rumination, and recover the psychological and physiological resources that unforgiveness consumed, without any direct interaction with the wrongdoer, without restoring the relationship, and without allowing any further access. The most important implication of this finding is the one most frequently missed. You do not have to see the person again, maintain any contact, or allow any access to your life in order to stop paying the price of not forgiving them. The forgiveness is for you. The relationship is a separate question. Research on self-compassion following interpersonal harm has found that extending to the wounded self the same care, understanding, and patience one would offer a close friend in comparable pain is among the strongest predictors of healthy recovery. Research has found that self-compassion in the aftermath of harm is associated with lower PTSD symptoms, lower depression, higher post-traumatic growth, and better physical health outcomes than self-blame, self-criticism, or the silent suffering of unacknowledged pain. Self-compassion in the context of harm does not minimize what happened. It extends to the person who was hurt the same basic warmth that forgiveness research suggests eventually extending to the person who hurt them, providing the emotional foundation for the processing of grief that genuine recovery requires. Research by Tedeschi and Calhoun on post-traumatic growth has found that meaning-making in the aftermath of harm, the construction of a coherent and personally significant account of how the harm changed the person, what it revealed, and what possibilities it opened alongside those it foreclosed, is one of the strongest predictors of positive psychological change following adversity. Research has found that post-traumatic growth is associated with improvements in the depth of relationships, appreciation for life, personal strength, and the sense of new possibilities previously unconsidered. The meaning that is made from harm does not deny the harm or the wrongdoer's responsibility. It integrates the harm into a life narrative in which the harm is no longer the final or organizing word. It does not require the harm to have been worth it. It requires only the willingness to ask what comes after it. The harm does not have to be the last thing the story says. It does not even have to be the most important thing. Research on victim recovery has found that the experience of being believed, having one's account of the harm received with validation by another person, is among the most powerful healing factors across populations and harm types. The harm that is witnessed by someone who receives it with genuine belief and care is processed differently than the harm carried alone. Research has found that social validation produces measurable reductions in the emotional isolation that amplifies harm's psychological impact, reduces the rumination partially driven by the need to convince oneself and others that the harm was real, and provides the relational context in which the processing of grief becomes possible. Being believed is not a minor comfort. Research has found it to be one of the primary conditions under which genuine recovery can begin. Research on apology effectiveness has found that apologies are not uniformly effective at reducing revenge motivation. Their impact depends critically on specific content and perceived sincerity. Apologies that include specific acknowledgement of what was done, explicit expression of remorse, clear acceptance of responsibility, and a credible commitment to change are significantly more effective than vague, partial, or responsibility-deflecting apologies. Research has also found that apologies perceived as strategic, offered to avoid consequences rather than to express genuine remorse, can paradoxically increase rather than decrease victim distress. A calculated apology confirms the wrongdoer's indifference to the harm in a new form, making it more painful than silence. The apology that heals and the apology that wounds are delivered through the same words. The difference is what the nervous system can detect underneath them. Research on time and recovery from interpersonal harm presents a more conditional picture than the common understanding of time, as a healer suggests. Time is associated with recovery when it contains the other conditions of healing: adequate social support, successful meaning-making, grief processing, and the reduction of rumination. Time without these conditions does not heal. Research has found that individuals who continue to ruminate about a harm years after its occurrence show emotional responses to the memory that are not significantly less intense than those who experienced comparable harm more recently. The passage of time provides the opportunity for healing. It does not provide the healing itself. What heals is what happens within the time, not the time passing around it. Research has found that interpersonal harm is encoded not only in narrative and cognition, but in the body. The physiological signature of the threat response, the tension, the altered breathing, the chronic activation, is not a metaphor for the harm. It is its somatic record. Body-based therapeutic approaches address this record directly. Research on somatic experiencing, EMDR with body tracking, and trauma-sensitive mindfulness has found measurable reductions in PTSD symptoms and physiological stress markers through interventions that work with the body's stored record of the harm rather than exclusively through narrative processing. Sometimes the body's record is more accessible than the cognitive account, and the body's record can be addressed without requiring the full narrative to be assembled first. The distinction that changes more than almost any other in the aftermath of harm is the distinction between grievance and grief. Grievance asks for the wrongdoer to pay. Grief asks for the loss to be acknowledged. Grievance keeps the attention on the perpetrator. Grief keeps it on what was lost. Grievance requires the wrongdoer's suffering for its resolution. Grief requires only the processing of what is gone. Research has found that people who are able to grieve the losses associated with interpersonal harm, the lost relationship, the lost sense of safety, the lost future, show better psychological outcomes than those who remain in grievance. The losses are real. They deserve to be grieved. But grieving them is a different movement from pursuing the person responsible for them. Grief moves through the loss toward what comes after. Grievance circles the person responsible indefinitely. Research on identity and recovery has documented the psychological significance of the transition from victim to survivor identity. The victim identity is organized around what was done. The harm is the central fact. The wrongdoer is the central character. The self is defined by what was inflicted upon it. The survivor identity retains the full reality of the harm while reorganizing around the self's continuing capacity, around what was survived, what was learned, what remains, and what is still possible. Research has found that this shift is associated with better psychological outcomes, higher post-traumatic growth, and stronger social functioning. It is not a denial of the harm. It is a relocation of the self from the position of the harm's passive recipient to the position of the person who continues with full knowledge of what happened towards something the harm does not determine. Research on post-traumatic growth and long-term recovery has found that it is possible to hold the full reality of having been genuinely wronged without remaining organized around that wrong. The harm can be acknowledged as real, the wrongdoer's responsibility recognized as clear, the losses fully grieved, and the person can still choose to place it in the context of a life that continues. Research has found this is not achieved through forgetting or minimizing. It is achieved through full acknowledgement, followed by the gradual reorientation of the self's organizing structure away from the harm as its center. The wrong happened. It was real. It mattered. It does not have to be the organizing principle of everything that comes after it. The revenge impulse, examined carefully, was never simply asking for the wrongdoer to suffer. Research has found more beneath it. It was asking for acknowledgement, for the harm to be recognized as real, for the wrongdoer to know what they did, for the record to be corrected, for the world to register what occurred, for someone to confirm that the person who was hurt deserved better. It was asking for the just world to reassert itself. It was asking for the meaning of the harm to be completed. And underneath all of these, in most cases, it was asking for something simpler. It was asking for the pain to stop. Research has found a difference between what justice asks for and what revenge asks for. Justice asks for acknowledgement, accountability, and the restoration of norms that protect everyone. Revenge asks for the wrongdoer's specific suffering as payment. Justice is satisfied by accountability. Revenge is rarely satisfied by anything. The acknowledgement, the comprehension, the recognition that the harm was real, these are what the revenge impulse was always pursuing. They are what justice, at its best, can sometimes provide. They are what revenge almost never actually does. Healing from harm does not look like the wrongdoer's suffering. Research has found this consistently. It does not look like the score being settled. It does not look like the verdict that was anticipated. It does not look like the moment the wrongdoer finally understands. Sometimes they never do. Healing looks like grief. It looks like bearing the weight of what happened until the weight is no longer the first thing you feel each morning. It looks like telling someone what happened and being believed. It looks like the day the harm is part of the story, not all of it. It looks like the return of your capacity to be fully present in something that has nothing to do with the person who hurt you. There is a moment in recovery, not dramatic, not announced. The wrongdoer stops occupying the foreground. They are still there in memory. The harm is still real. Nothing about what happened has been revised or excused or minimized, but they have moved slowly and without ceremony from the center to somewhere nearer the periphery. And in the space they have vacated, something that had been waiting becomes available. Not happiness necessarily, not peace as a destination arrived at once, just the ordinary forward motion of a life that is no longer organized around the event of its interruption. The revenge impulse wanted to restore what was lost. It could not. What actually restores it is simpler, harder, and less satisfying to describe. It is the gradual, effortful, often incomplete process of turning back toward the life that is still here. The score was never going to be even. It never is. But the life, the one that was always there, behind the grievance, was waiting. If this stayed with you tonight, please like and subscribe.